You listen to Watch Your Voyage. We have the one and only, the man that went up against the world's vaccine industry in a sense when it was an unfashionable thing to do, to say the least, and has his own vaccine company and has developed uh, vaccines across coronaviruses, swine flu vaccines, and I'm sure like probably hundreds, if not thousands, of other ones in the experimental process, as well as things that have been deployed out in the world. You've also been a professor at Flinders University for many years. And I mean, I'm sure that's the tip of the iceberg of the lineage of your life. We have none other than Professor Nikolai Petrovsky. Welcome.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here.
That's good. Good.
I'm looking forward to hearing what questions you have and what you'd like to know, and sharing some insights, hopefully, with your audience.
Yeah, well, look, I do have some spicy questions that I'm going to
Right.
get to later. I don't know if you heard the Joe Rogan episode with RFK Jr.
Of course. I mean, who would have missed it?
All right. Well, I have some questions in regards to that. Since I brought it
Okay, all
up,
right,
I
yeah,
want to
because
go into it.
I think
And
most of it I was happy with. There are a few little bits, obviously where the science wasn't quite right.
well, that's what because
Yeah.
and just to kind of preface it, I am no like scholar of science myself. I'm just a man that wants to learn. And when it comes to scientific things and health related things, I just want to live my life to the best of my ability, be as healthy as I can, and overcome my vices as much as I can to be healthier. And that's why I'm kind of interested in talking about vaccines, especially with you, and given that it's become such a big conversation over the last few years. But I wrote down a few things in which RFK said, and I want you to kind of fact check with me if you're comfortable
Okay.
doing so.
Yeah, no. I'll certainly call it out. I mean, science is about getting things correct, and we shouldn't be scared of that. Sometimes science tells us we're doing the wrong thing. Again, we should own up and say, okay, we got it wrong. We have to fix it. So yeah, I think science is about truth, and so there's no good side to truth. There's no bad side to truth. The truth is simply the truth. So hopefully I can address that, and there won't be any questions I won't be too scared to answer, because we shouldn't be scared of the truth.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was quite interesting that people from like, I guess, spokesmen of the vaccine industry from the scientific establishment perspective weren't willing to go on Joe. So looks like you'd be willing to go on Joe.
Look, yeah, if I was, I think he did invite me a couple of years ago, right in the midst of the pandemic, but I was so busy developing the vaccine that, and I didn't really know a lot about him at that point. I'd sort of just was aware he existed, and that he wasn't necessarily considered mainstream, and he was a bit of a provocateur.
Yep,
Um,
wasn't quite on your
and
radar.
maybe at the time I myself was a little bit conservative, and I know the media people at, I think, at Flinders Uni, when I raised this, that I'd been invited, they're going, oh, Fox, they had a group of media channels that they said were far too on the edge.
Yep, and he was one of
Fox
them.
was one of them.
Fox.
Yeah, Fox News. And him similarly, and I probably regret having been influenced by that conservatism, which you know, unfortunately does get in the way of the truth. Because I still believe you should be able to talk to anyone. Doesn't mean you have to agree with their views.
Hmm.
In fact, if no one gets on with them and disagrees with them or corrects them, that's surely only going in the wrong direction. Like, what I would love to do is go on and agree with him where he's right, where the science actually does support what he says, and correct him on those matters where he might have got it a bit wrong.
Alrighty.
And so I think it's our duty, if we're interested in the truth, to debate people who have different views to us. Whereas I think that this conservatism that's crept into society that says, don't speak on any of these channels, they're too, what they'd call extremist, actually makes those channels even more extremist, because they never get someone from the other side on, because they're not agreeing to. So yeah, in retrospect, I would have enjoyed actually being interviewed by him, and maybe the opportunity will come up in the future.
Maybe. Who knows? This could be the catalyst. It'd be great. It'd
Yeah,
be
well,
great. Who knows?
he
We
might
might see
watch
it.
this and go, "Oh, gee,
Who
I like
knows?
this
Who
guy.
knows?
He seems to get his head around some of the facts and not be scared of the facts." And I think that's when we talk about vaccines, there is a lot of sort of paternalistic and maternalistic attitude of public health figures. They're very protective of vaccines. But unfortunately, sometimes that protectiveness turns into what I would say verges on dishonesty. In other
Yeah,
words,
okay.
they're trying so hard to say vaccines are wonderful and they're great and everyone should accept them, that sometimes they go too far and they actually deny problems that scientifically we know exist. And that's where I suddenly have a real problem. And they say, "Oh, Nick, you should stay silent," even when we're maybe not telling the truth,
Mm.
because we think it's in everyone's interest. And I'm going,
Yeah, it's like
no,
in the industry's
no, there is
interest,
no
not the
such thing
people's.
that I'm aware where it's in everyone's interest um, to be misled or not to be told the truth, to be actually told mistruths.
So in
That's a
Australia,
point I just find
fair enough.
difficult. I understand where they're coming from. This very old school paternalistic, maternalistic. We know better, and then they're the masses are not sufficiently educated to understand. So the only way we can get them to behave the way we think they should is we have to trick them, or we have to lie to them, or we have to mislead them. So it's not that they're not in their own heads doing it for a better cause, but I just can't see how you can justify that, because it simply isn't true. Just because we've trained in science for 20, 30 years doesn't mean that you don't have amateur scientists, people who just read a lot, and that sometimes they might know more than the person who's actually called the scientist. So we have to be really careful we don't judge people.
Fair enough. Well, that's a great preface for hopefully some
Okay.
questions you'll be able to answer. Um, but one of the things that I got from that podcast was that this is US, and tell me if this extends to Australia, and I'm sure
Mm.
you'd know kind of world policy around this, that Reagan and the Democrats passed the Vaccine Act in 1986, making negligence the ingredients used, and essentially gave full indemnity for downstream liabilities, removing the incentive to make vaccines safe.
Look, yeah. Again, that you have to put that all into context. So what happened back then was that vaccines had become commodities. So in other words, the price of vaccines was getting down to $1 a dose, 50 cents a dose. So the companies that were making those vaccines that were being used in all the children got to a point where their factories were at the end of their lives. They'd been running for 20, 30 years. And so they were progressively shutting those factories, and they weren't building new ones because they couldn't, because there simply wasn't enough profit in the products they were selling.
Why
So
wasn't there enough profit?
well, because the price was $1 a dose.
And was that government forced for the price to be low, or was it?
Yeah, because up till then, and again, they're changing views, but there was a view that the demand for vaccines in the world was very large, and groups like the Gates Foundation said we want to drive the price of vaccines down to ridiculously low levels, because that should mean that everyone in the world can get access to them. But it backfired, because rather than giving more people access, what it did is made vaccines unprofitable.
Mm.
So basically the vaccine industry in the US collapsed, because as each factory came to the end of its life, it was shut. And so suddenly they had no vaccines. So they started importing them from other countries. But in order to try and turn that around, one of the arguments that the vaccine manufacturers had said was, well, not only are we selling these vaccines at a very low cost, it's not really profitable, but if something goes wrong, if a mother claims that this vaccine has caused harm to her child, and she sues us, and we have to pay a $10 million payout, which in the US is unfortunately not uncommon, or $100 million payout, regardless of the science or the merit, because again, a lot of these things are arbitrary often. It's hard to prove that this caused that. In the US, courts will sometimes say, well, we don't care, we're going to give you the damages anyway.
Yeah. Okay.
So they said, so just one lawsuit like that means that the tiny bit of profit we're hoping to make that justifies us staying in business will disappear. So we'll only continue to supply vaccines in the US if the government take on the risk aspect of us getting sued. So it wasn't as it's commonly put that this was somehow trying to, save the companies from lawsuits, or was designed to cover up the fact vaccines were unsafe. I mean, all vaccines unfortunately do have rare side effects. That's a given, just like all drugs do. So what the industry was saying, these events are going to happen. Might be 1 in a million or 1 in 10 million, but they will happen, and that will cost us more than we're making from selling the hundreds of millions of doses. So, either you have to push the price up and the government will have to pay $50 or $100 a dose for the vaccines, which you can imagine the government wasn't very keen to do, or the government has to take away some of this risk from us.
And so did they disable claims being able to be made for injuries of all sorts, and just kind of nobody was able to do anything about it, and there was just like basic schemes to support people? Or was it that they could, those claims that would result in those millions of dollars getting from the vaccine industry then being paid out by the government to those people?
Yeah, so well, it's somewhere in between the two, as I understand. So essentially, the government took over the responsibility for compensation, but like most governments, when they compensate, they have power to legislate to cap all of that. So whereas a company, if someone sues them for 100 million and they lose, they just have to pay the 100 million. The government can bring in a compensation scheme and say, the maximum payout is $100,000. So that's where, when the government take it over, it's not a free for all. The governments are smart enough to say, look, this could be quite expensive, and so they will then put various caps and constraints on who can get compensation. The advantage is typically the government will say you don't have to prove it in a court of law, so more people will get compensation. They just have to put a reasonable case forward, often to a committee or a panel, so it doesn't go into a massive legal court action, which has its own problems, of course. So, but the consequence is we'll pay out more, but the amount each person gets will be much less, and and we have similar schemes in Australia, and a lot of countries around the world have those schemes. But I think it's wrong to suggest that it was done as a cover-up.
Yeah, as like nefarious intent, but
no,
it was a good
wasn't
intent
at all. It was very good
to
intent.
address a problem, and then it could have potentially, depending on what the truth of the matter is, if it's, if vaccines are great and everything we want them to be, and all the products have been great, then it's like, okay, it's worked. But if they're not good, then it's a road to hell has been paved with good intentions kind of idea.
Look, I don't know. That's
but
true
that's
of
why
every
I'm asking
It's
you,
like
right?
every policy
obviously.
there's always things that happen. You go, gee,
So, and just to quote another one of the things that he said that in 1977, the McGinley study found that it was less than 1% decline in death could be attributed to vaccines. And he said that as like a counterpoint to the 2000 CDC and John Hopkins Institute Gaia study, which he said went through the history of vaccines and health claims, and showed the huge decline in mortalities from infectious diseases was, in fact, an 80% drop. And what caused that? Was it vaccines? And it was that they found it had almost nothing to do with vaccines and everything to do with refrigeration for food, transportation systems, roads, housing, sanitation, nutrition, and sewage treatment, chlorine. And the real cause of the historic deaths was more to do with malnutrition, as like the leading cause, rather than people dying from those diseases as the front end cause.
Again, if you need to pull it apart,
please.
So certainly, over the last 100 years, improved nutrition, healthcare has dramatically reduced like childhood mortality. Vaccines certainly have played a role, and a complementary role. I don't think you can be so black and white. And again, when people do these analyses, they have to make a whole lot of assumptions. Because generally you can't actually tease it out. How do you separate out improving living standards from the introduction of vaccines? Because these things were generally happening at the same time in combination. So you can't do a control study where you say we're going to leave this half of the children malnourished and prove
see what happens,
prove that even if they get vaccinated that they are going to still do badly, and conversely that the healthy children who are not vaccinated do well. So you can't do a placebo controlled study.
And was the timeline of effects like side by side?
Well, again, a lot of these things happened, over the same decades. Because they're not discontinuous. It's not like living standards went from bad to good overnight. They happened over many decades. Introduction of vaccines, similarly, happened over many decades. Where various vaccines were both introduced, because about every 20 or 30 years, a new vaccine might get developed over the last 100, 200 years. And, initially it might just be given to a small subset of the population, and then progressively that would expand. So it's not like there's a cutoff point. You say, we had no vaccines here and we had vaccines here, and this is what happened. So because of that, you have to be very careful when you look at these analyses. You can't say it was this or it was that. But I would say to present the good side of vaccines, if you go to, say, a country like Cuba, right? Very poor, extremely poor, in fact, but they are very passionate about their vaccines. They make all their own vaccines because they can't afford Western vaccines.
What kind of vaccines?
The first major one that they made was a hepatitis B vaccine. And so they rolled that out through Cuba. And they're very proud of the fact they've eradicated, essentially, the transmission of hepatitis B in Cuba. And they have the data showing from the date of rollout of the vaccine, the number of cases, because again, they have great data. They collect data from the whole population. And they can show, this is the time at which we extinguished hepatitis B, the last case sort of thing, thanks to this vaccine. Now, they actually provide that vaccine, I think, to 50 different developing world countries as a consequence, So
there you go.
So to sort of, again, lump all vaccines in a single basket and dismiss them and say they haven't had an impact, it simply isn't true. Vaccines have
I
had
don't think that's
what
he's saying.
Well, again,
he
is in a way. He's saying, it's overstated the benefit, that those benefits were going to come from better nutrition anyway and better healthcare. That, to be honest, there is an element of that, but it would be, I think, very unreasonable. And again, there's been a lot of studies done that claim the opposite, that if you look at the rollout of the vaccine, you can show a mortality benefit flowing from that. So it's always difficult because, again, there's a lot of reasons people are dying. And so it takes 10 or 20 years often after you roll out a vaccine to be able to look back and say, all right, what did this vaccine achieve? It's not something you can necessarily measure like instantaneously. But so
Fair enough.
no,
As we saw in COVID.
well, again, COVID has been it's a basket case.
Yes,
To be frank,
put it
because
lightly.
everything that was done, including in the vaccine space, broke all the rules. And I think some of those rules were good rules that we developed over many decades, and principles about how to manage vaccine policy, and they were all just ripped up and thrown away, and we had politicians and various people, making decisions and creating new rule books, and not having, I guess, those decisions reviewed by the people like myself who'd been in the industry doing this work
Yeah, which
for
is
the last
bureaucrats.
30 or 40 years. So unfortunately, that all happened in the context of a pandemic where they argued that there wasn't time to get expert opinion. There wasn't time to review things. Well, again, that's not necessarily true.
Yeah, and
And
obviously
I think we
that's
did have much more time than was made out.
yeah, fair. And especially in Australia because we were locked down, right?
Yeah,
In terms of our
exactly.
our borders and
Exactly. We
stuff.
had effectively no
Yeah,
transmission, so
yeah.
we had lots of time to think about it. I was shocked when, after having a year and a half or so to think about it, they then acted as if they hadn't thought about it at all with a lot of the implementation
And
of the vaccine.
I wanna get into
Yeah.
COVID more a bit later. I
Yeah.
wanna just
Yeah.
go through all these first just
Sure.
'cause
No,
I
absolutely.
genuinely, obviously makes you question when you hear someone put together an argument and it seems reasonable and they're saying they have a lot of evidence and they come from, good background to be able to be as biased as they can be. You go, "Huh." So I trust that you're obviously
Well, again,
super knowledgeable.
I'm
You
I'm
know a
happy
lot.
to,
Like, have you read these studies? Have you
what?
seen these
Yeah,
studies
I
that
have
he
I
talks
have
about?
seen these studies, and again, there's studies and there's studies. If you have to be so careful you don't cherry pick, and
Yeah.
I see this in both sides. I've been in a recent court case where we were looking at all the data for the COVID vaccines and the data again, and they, to be honest, the government had just cherry picked, or their advisors, only the papers that supported their argument, and they were oblivious to an enormous amount of literature that said that, in fact, the complete opposite. So with science, if you go looking for something to support your argument, you'll always find it, because the great thing about science is it has all perspectives.
Yeah.
Um, but that is not how you do good science. So good science is you have to be balanced. You have to take into account all papers, all perspectives, and then try to integrate that together. And then, based on that, make a decision. Well, is one view more likely to be correct than the other? But this idea that you can go and get papers to support, say, an anti-vaccine stance, yeah, you'll find them.
Mm,
Are they correct?
mm.
Are they, being overlooked, or is it that there's a much bigger body of data that actually sort of suggests that those papers are maybe not necessarily as accurate, or that they're missing certain important facts? So it's really important to have balance, and I think the reason I started speaking out is when I saw so much imbalance happening on both sides.
Mm.
So you could argue, yes, he does have a tendency to be quoting only papers that are, favourable to his arguments, which I think are only selective. But I equally have seen, vaccine lobbyists doing exactly the same thing, only quoting, papers that show enormous benefits and ignoring the others. So somehow we need more people like me who are happy to just speak the
Call a
truth,
spade a spade,
call
yeah.
a spade, and admit that there's no absolutes in this.
Mm.
It's complex, and there are pros and cons, and there's risk, and so this should all be about risk management and assessing benefit versus risk. And when you think about vaccines in terms of risk and benefit, you should never get it wrong, because you should always be looking for situations where the benefits clearly are greater than the risks. In that case, that's where you should be putting your efforts. But if you find that there's a situation where the risks potentially outweigh the benefits, and I think that's what he was alluding to, then yeah, we should pull the vaccine that's involved, or restrict its use to only those people in which we can clearly show a benefit. And I think during COVID, again, that's got so far out of whack, that risk-benefit discussion. They're not absolutely, to say, they're safe and effective is scientifically rubbish, right?
Yeah.
But to say that they're completely unsafe and completely ineffective is equally scientific rubbish. What we have to find is that middle ground that is the truth.
Yeah, like who's it good for?
And I can't find anyone who's interested in talking about the truth here, because they're either on this side of the room or on that side of the room. And some of us, just a few of us, are sitting there who have probably the most knowledge in the field, sitting there in the middle, just going, what the hell's going on here? Everyone seems to hate us because we're actually trying to talk about the real science that, of vaccines.
Come on, man, they got politics to push.
No, that's right. And so you start getting abused from both sides, it's insane.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess when we're talking about safe and effective and looking at science and the studies and making sure we have well-balanced studies, the double-blind is seen as like the gold standard of studies. Where does double-blind testing in the vaccine world take place?
So, well, normally that's done as part of what we call the phase 3 programs, very large groups of individuals where they're randomized and they're blinded to their treatment. So half get, a placebo, which is, basically nothing, and the other half get the vaccine, and they don't know which one they've had. And in that situation, you can measure the side effects, obviously, in the people who've had it and haven't had it. And similarly, you can measure the effectiveness in those who've had it and haven't had it. And that allows you to do your risk-benefit analysis.
Yeah, okay. And does that risk-benefit analysis of the double-blind happen for all vaccines that get administered? Let's just use kids as an example, because obviously I think most people are having this questioning about, do I want to give it to my kids? It started with 3 and now it's 70 or however many it is. I don't have kids. Don't know. I just got what I got. Didn't
From
remember
the interview,
it. Yeah, didn't remember it.
It's a lot.
So yeah, are they all go through double-blind studies, and are they at adequate time periods? And yeah, what's the world of what's going on?
Yeah, so traditionally, and so if we go back pre-pandemic, because it really is a very different what's been happening in the last 3 years. But if we go back prior to that, the vaccine industry was very conservative, and the regulators, which we call the TGA, or in the US is the FDA, who have to approve it, were very conservative, because you're going to be giving vaccines to hundreds of millions, if not billions of people. So, the idea was that it had to be unbelievably safe. You had to prove basically that, it wasn't going to hurt more than 1 in a million people. Because when you're giving it, say, to 1 billion and you hurt 1 in a million, that's still 1,000 people who are hurt by the vaccine. So they had very stringent criteria, and you had to do trials, not just one, but multiple, often in tens of thousands of children, or depending on the age group you're giving the vaccine. And that might have to, those trials might have to go on for years, not just for months. Collecting data, still watching what's happening in those two groups. So it was incredibly stringent and incredibly difficult, actually, to get a vaccine approved. It typically took about 20 years collecting that data before everyone was convinced that it was sufficiently safe and effective to actually roll it out.
Yeah, okay.
So if you're talking, your childhood vaccines like hepatitis B or pertussis, tetanus, all of these, measles, mumps, rubella, then, generally, particularly the ones that have been developed in the last 30 or 40 years, have gone through incredibly rigorous testing. If you talk about vaccines that have been used for 100 years, well, we can't speak to what they went through, but then we have the real world experience with those vaccines in billions of children
Yeah.
over the last 50, 100 years.
Mhm.
So we've collected the data in maybe a different way, but these days, as I say, typically you would do it in these very specific controlled studies. That changed obviously with COVID.
Yeah, well, one of the things that through just the COVID conversations that took place was, um, I guess, showing how I'd say the pharmaceutical industry at large has the ability to uh, pluck out anomalies in studies that might have adverse reactions to whatever the drug is or the vaccine at the start of the trial if they have that at the very start. Does is that ring true from what you've seen being in the industry?
Again, it's important not to make generalizations. So normally none of these things would happen because the system is designed normally to be very protective of the community of individuals.
Yeah.
Um, and you know, so there are a lot of hoops you have to jump through. Um, some people would argue too many, because it was costing billions to develop a new vaccine, and it was taking 20 years. So people were saying we're not getting these vaccines through, easily enough. Um, with COVID, that equation was somewhat flipped because of the perceived urgency. That basically, as I say, that rule book was just thrown out.
Yeah.
We had trials that were initially started with the phase threes. They did what we call an interim analysis, which is not normal, but because they wanted some quick access, are they doing something or not? The initial trials, particularly the mRNA, analyzed the data after 2 months. Now, normally, we'd be doing our first analysis maybe after 2 years, right? Because there's no like
Yeah,
when
yeah, yeah.
the safety is all important, and so the regulator in the old days would say, "Look, I don't care how long this takes, right? You have to convince me that there's both no short-term side effects that are a worry, but also no long-term side effects or worry. So if that means it takes 5, 10, 15, 20 years to get there, I don't care that the industry is suffering and then this may not be profitable. That's what we're going to do."
Mm.
With COVID under the cover of the emergency, all those normal rules were thrown out, and that to us was very scary because all those rules were put in for good reason. There have been issues in the past with things going wrong with vaccines. Again, we shouldn't shy away from that. I'm sure RFK would remind us of some of those,
Yeah.
episodes where things did go wrong and safety issues emerged and vaccines had to be pulled off the market.
Yeah,
So,
well, I think the historical one that he referred to in the Rogan episode was all about the mercury in
well,
vaccines.
that's not real. That's something different because that's what we call a theoretical problem. So there's no proof one way or the other that mercury actually has caused any harm, right?
Okay,
There's
well,
no proof, but
okay.
no, the I guess the situations are like back in the 70s there was an influenza pandemic, and similarly they rolled out a vaccine very rapidly, and it
Mm.
caused a problem called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is an autoimmune paralysis. And they had about 10 or 15 of these cases in the US when they rolled out this flu vaccine. It was, clearly associated with the vaccine, and they had to pull it because, in fact, it turned out that flu wasn't that serious. Now, you could say that somewhat reminiscent of COVID, that a bit the same sort of
Mm. Yeah,
scenario
they're like
where
rush, rush,
where
rush.
there's rush, 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 and you can understand that in that very early stage before you know how serious the disease is. because, I think there was a perception this is killing everyone.
Oh, look, I was freaking out at the start.
know,
I was like, what's the bug out plan,
Yeah,
guys?
so yes, at that point, I think it is good to push development forward.
But like R&D
but
development.
but that's R&D and clinical trials. Most of us had the view that what should have then happened, which didn't, was that, within a few months of the start of the pandemic, well before the vaccines came on the market, like about a year before, in fact, we realized that, yes, there were lots of people dying, and they were all over 80 years of age.
Yes.
Right?
Well, that was especially in Italy, right?
90% of everyone who was dying was, extremely elderly, and they often had diabetes and heart disease and other problems, right? So they were a high risk group. So that meant that, in terms of rolling a vaccine out early, in other words, you're going to accept there's a big risk because we haven't fully developed this, we haven't fully tested it. That was the truth. Whatever they say about this being normally tested and having gone through the normal processes is completely false. All right? It's not possible in the space of 6 months.
No.
Right?
Well,
to do any of the normal testing, right?
There's
None
no
of
such thing
it.
as
The
long-term.
animal testing hadn't been done. The long-term human testing hadn't been done. There wasn't any time. So you had what you might consider, some early data showing there was some benefit, right, in terms of reducing the risk of infection. We thought, as people inside the industry, all right, we know this is still a risky product. It hasn't yet completed all the normal testing. But there are people like over 80 where if they get COVID, they probably 1 in 3 of them are going to die from it.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
It was around 25 to 30%.
For really old people.
For really old people.
Yeah.
You look at the nursing homes.
That's huge.
It was wiping out, a third of the population of Australian nursing homes. So the obvious thing to do is to say the benefit in those people of a vaccine is massive.
Yeah.
Even if that vaccine has serious side effects.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
Even if it might, dare I say it, result in the death of a few of those people, it will save more people than it will harm. So this is all risk benefit.
Yeah, and not at like a 49-51, but at more significant than that in terms of what it would save to what it would kill.
Well, one has to outweigh the other.
Yeah.
So, does it matter if it again, you put it in context of a cancer drug.
Yes.
Like, cancer drugs are highly toxic and they kill a lot of the people who receive. If you've seen anyone on chemotherapy, they're effectively taking them close to death, and some will go to death as a consequence. But, if that cancer drug stops 1 person out of 10 their cancer progressing, no one cares about the fact that
they're going to die anyway, right?
Has killed 30% of the people taking it. So when we talk about these extreme cases, in the elderly, you could justify a highly dangerous vaccine would still potentially be more beneficial than causing harm, and you could justify
probably on voluntary means, right?
Absolutely, that's
probably the
everything I preface
yeah.
in modern medicine. We were taught after Nuremberg, and a group of people were hanged for having tested medical therapies on people without their consent, and that was the whole principle of informed consent. That you cannot and should never force a medical treatment on another human against their will.
Especially the Nazi ones, because I heard about the dry ice of the arm, and then they hit it with the hammer, like while they're alive and standing there, like, oh,
yeah.
It's
so,
grim.
but so that's where the modern principles of informed consent came from. Was essentially the Nuremberg trials, and as I say, people were executed for having breached what wasn't legislated or wasn't encapsulated in law at the time they did it, but they retrospectively said, they should have followed such a code, and even though they weren't aware of it, we're going to execute them anyway. So
just the value of human life.
It was really to demonstrate to the world that this is unacceptable. But we're now back in the same scenario, and we're being told it's acceptable all of a sudden to force and mandate, experimental treatments on people.
Yes.
That is a
Mm.
serious concern that hasn't been properly addressed.
No.
Is how can that be justified? I don't believe it can, and I think again a lot of governments and a lot of health departments have lost the plot
Yeah, well, I wanna go into
and really forgotten, you know, where we've been and why we developed all these things, like the Nuremberg Code and, the principles of informed consent, the principle that you can't force someone to take an experimental treatment. You know, they seem to have forgotten all of that in their desire to madly, push these things out. And then you have to ask why. Do they believe that this is a public health crisis, or do they have other, motives for doing so?
yeah, is it the Georgia Guidestones playing out? That's the question. That's the real question.
Well,
Who knows?
again, I think, you probably different reasons in different places and a lot of people just following the lead. I think, we had a lot of this coming from, large organizations sort of saying these, it's a good thing
Mm,
to have mandates and passports and, um, I think a lot of countries just the politicians just blindly followed the lead. Um,
mm.
Probably didn't even think about what they were doing. And I think the ones that actually didn't strictly follow the lead, countries like Sweden, got really
Berated,
attacked and
yeah.
berated. It turns out unfairly because, again, the data is the data. I mean, Sweden, if you look at the overall mortality rates in Sweden, they're much less than the rest of Europe. They didn't bring in a lot of these draconian sort of rules.
So how'd they compare to us per capita? Because obviously we are an island. We
Yeah.
had nobody else come in pretty much. We, confined to our cities pretty much, or to our states, for a good time there. How did we compare to Sweden?
So I think we're still favourable relative to Sweden because of that long period where we had no infection at all, whereas they were tolerating the infection, and in fact again taking a principle that they wanted the young people to get infected in effect because that would build up natural immunity
Mm,
while vaccinating the elderly who were the more at risk. So that was sort of their approach. I think Australia is in terms of deaths has caught up but where Australia was really very lucky, and it really was a fluke. With a lucky country for good reason.
being isolated.
Is well, one, we're isolated and we were able to eradicate the virus pretty well from the population for most of that first year until there was a political decision to open up
Mm.
and
And then we're on
open our
Omicron by
borders.
then, and it wasn't
And
as
that was
bad.
right. It was almost like it's almost like they were predicting it because they opened the borders. Delta started to expand, and it would have been catastrophic in truth. But Omicron came in like the next week and just totally took over, and obviously was much milder.
Mm.
And that really was, I think, just a complete fluke and very fortuitous. Because I think if Delta had gone through the whole Australian population, irrespective of the vaccination rates,
Yeah, well, it
we would
wasn't
have seen a much higher death rate.
it because the vaccine wasn't made for Delta, right? And what was the effectiveness of the vax, or is, I guess, the vaccine to the Delta strain?
So it's actually not too bad against Delta. So it certainly dropped from the original strains
So if
to
the
Delta.
original
So
strain was it
well,
96%?
that was I
Uh,
mean, again, yeah. Then this is where we have to be factual. So against the original strain, you ranged from like around 50% protection, 50 to 60% from AstraZeneca,
mhm,
which a lot of people in Australia, particularly the elderly, had,
yes.
and that was against the original strain. It was worse again against
And
Delta.
that's just
So
death,
that that
right?
that was AstraZeneca. So that was a viral vector vaccine, and then the mRNA vaccines clearly did a lot better than that, particularly in those first few months when they were measuring it, because you have to remember they stopped measuring it after they got their first result, which again scandalized a lot of us. They actually dismantled the placebo groups in the phase 3 trials because they vaccinated them all.
1 dose or 2 dose or 3 dose or 4 dose or 5 dose? Because we're up to 5 doses
Yeah.
now in the
So no, but
community.
this is going back to the clinical trials and the original strains.
Yeah,
this is
so
2
that's
doses.
what I'm asking. Oh, okay, 2
So this
doses
is,
in the original
2
trial.
doses was the original idea. That, WHO actually were telling us that, if it wasn't 1 dose and effective for life, then they weren't interested. How wrong they were.
Twist my arm.
But it's fascinating because that was their view before the vaccines were rolled out. You should, if you know what you're doing, be able to give a single dose and give people long-term protection. So that didn't work.
I mean, I like that idea, right?
And Johnson & Johnson
idea.
developed a similar version to AstraZeneca in the US, and it's just 1 dose. Only trouble is,
didn't work.
Did bugger all.
For long enough.
And then it was taken off the market.
Okay,
and disappeared. So AstraZeneca was at the bottom end.
50 to 60 to stop death. Or to stop hospital.
Well, again, there's a lot of misinformation about the trials. So because the trials were largely done in younger people, because initially you tend to do your trials in younger people, and then as you get data, extend it to more frail people. So a lot of the people in the trials were younger. Those people were at very low risk of hospitalization or death from COVID. So the trials were not powered statistically to actually show any effect on severe disease or death, right? There are a lot of claims made afterwards which statistically are meaningless. And again, in science, we have this thing called a p-value, the statistical significance. And you can show a difference, but if that difference is not statistically significant, a scientist can't say this number is bigger than this number unless they can show it is statistically different.
And it didn't have the statistical significance.
None of the trials had any power to even show statistical significance, let alone calculate it, right? So when they say, the AstraZeneca was 90% effective against preventing severe disease and death, in its phase 3 trial, statistically, that is complete misinformation. There were 9 cases versus 1 cases, p-value 0.3, 0.4. Basically, scientifically, you cannot claim there was any benefit. I know to a layperson, they'll go, but 9 versus 1, that's 9 times higher. But, if we're talking science, if we're doing this properly, right, there are rules and you have to follow the rules. So none of the trials actually statistically validly showed any benefit in terms of severe disease or death. So the only thing they could measure in those trials was what we call symptomatic disease. So this was by and large people who were getting mild infections and were being shown by PCR to be infected. And that was what was reduced 90% in the mRNA studies.
And
basically mild disease that went from PCR positive to PCR negative.
Didn't the PCRs have fundamental error with them themselves, as the creator or the inventor of the PCR test came out and said that they're not meant to be used for this function?
So, I mean, there were a number of problems with the PCR test. The first is that the FDA and CDC in the US decided that only the CDC PCR test was allowed to be used by every hospital and laboratory in the whole United States. And it turned out that test was completely defective and didn't work. And so you had these labs and even our lab, developing our own PCRs. And in Australia, we were allowed to do that. And they were all working. And, you'd soon see if one wasn't working because someone else would have one that was working. They'd give different results and you'd quickly. But because in the US, they weren't allowed by law to do anything other than use the CDC test. And the CDC test, as it turned out, was completely defective, meant that all PCR testing in the whole United States was just complete rubbish. It was meaningless.
Because isn't the rapid antigen...
That took a long time for that to be appreciated and for that to be fixed. So they had a particular problem with PCR in the US, which
how was ours
RFK
different?
might refer to.
How was ours different then?
So anyone can make a PCR test. It's a very simple thing to do, to design a PCR to detect viral DNA or viral RNA. So typically there's not one test. Different labs will develop their own test and they'll test it out and show it's working. The common problem in PCRs, all PCRs, right?
The technology.
The technology, right, is an amplification technology. So it's very sensitive. So the more what we call cycles you do, so each cycle, when we talk about a cycle, it's an amplification. So imagine each cycle in a PCR amplifies the signal 1,000 times. So we do one cycle, we amplify the signal 1,000 times. Do 2 cycles, it's now 1,000,000 times. Do 3 cycles, it's now a trillion.
That's compounded.
Right.
Yeah.
No, yeah, but and we've started from a very small base. So if there's a tiny error or problem or contaminant in that starting material, and we now take it to 35 cycles, right? That's at the extreme nonsensical end of PCR. That is like,
and what would we
if there was one molecule in the room, right, of DNA that just happened to float in, that would now show up positive.
And what were we doing?
And in the US, they were accepting PCRs with cycles of 35 cycles. It was completely nonsensical. So very early on in Australia, they said, look, if it's not positive at 25 cycles, forget it.
Wasn't 25 still very high?
25 is still high. I mean, again, you're taking a small amount of genetic material, because when you swab a nose, maybe, there's 10 or 20 virus particles. So it is an advantage that you have this amplification, but the more you amplify, the more you're amplifying just noise,
error,
and turning it into a signal. And so you're right. Yes, the less cycles, the better. The more likely a positive is to be a true positive. And certainly once you go beyond 25 cycles, and this is where I think the people who invented the original PCR are going, this is madness. You know what I mean?
Okay.
This is not designed for this purpose.
Okay.
Especially when you're just doing this, outside in the rain, or you're swabbing people, going in a big line, where you're not, where you're not able to control, and so there probably is a bit of cross contamination going on and everything. With PCR, any cross contamination is going to cause massive problems.
And with driving through the car and having wind blowing and all sorts, you could easily
have
something get in there. Okay, and then it'll be a false positive.
Or someone coughs, 3 cars down,
and it floats.
And that and all you need is one virion to land on the swab. And
was that the same with the Australian 25 cycles? That would be a similar scenario.
No, so it's 25 in PCR is you between 20 and 25 cycles is normal in for a PCR. So it's in the range that it doesn't become completely crazy. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Okay.
All
right.
So I think in Australia, we allowed different labs to develop them. There wasn't just a single one. So you could even run it on 2 different ones and compare them. That's a good way to tell if one's positive, one's negative. There's a problem. That they also early on recognized, because we weren't being dictated to by the CDC, who were telling everyone they had to do it a particular way and run it to X number of cycles with defective material to start with. So there was more freedom here, and fortunately that freedom actually meant we got on top of that. So PCRs in Australia were, I think, overall, I can't speak for all of them, but I think the ones that got adopted actually are very solid and are still being used, to this day. So I think that's why I'm saying the PCR problem was really a massive problem in the US.
Yeah, okay. It's an American issue, not necessarily an Australian issue.
But it is fascinating, because I think people just, these are things easy to get wrong, particularly for a lay person.
Like, I don't know the difference between 35 cycles and 25 cycles or 20 cycles. I don't even know what these cycles mean.
Yeah, but basically each round is an amplification.
Yeah, okay, fair enough.
And it's a bit like when you get feedback in a microphone, that's you just get insane amplification.
I do know a bit more about that. Yeah. Okay, so I just want to jump back to some of this RFK stuff and touch into that bit about Mercury. So, what he said was that Eli Lilly in 1932 found in his study that mercury leaves the body quickly. And then in 2003, the Picciero CDC study showed that mercury on a tuna sandwich stayed in the kids for 64 days or 2 months. And then when it was injected with that mercury in a vaccine, that it disappeared from the blood in a week, but it was not found in the excrement, the sweat, the hair, the nails. It wasn't being able to found anywhere. And then that Thomas Burbacher from Seattle did a study with monkeys and was able to kill the monkeys and do the autopsy, and found that the mercury went away in a week, but during the post-mortem it hadn't left their body. The ethyl mercury went past the blood-brain barrier and lodged itself in there, causing severe inflammation.
So there's a lot in, to dissect again there. I mean, the first thing he said that was actually incorrect is that it was put in as an adjuvant. My whole background is as an adjuvant developer, and I can tell you it wasn't put in there as an adjuvant. It was put in as a preservative. And so the reason it was in there was to stop bacteria growing in the vaccine vial. So it was a problem back in the bad old days, and we're talking here in Australia, in particularly like the 60s and 70s, sort of post Second World War. They put vaccines into multi-dose vials. So in other words, like, the nurse could pull out a dose and jab this child, and then pull out another dose from the same vial and jab the next child, and so on. So because they it was cheaper to do it that way. It's just more efficient.
Put it in a different syringe and keep going.
Yeah, well, essentially, yeah, they would just draw it up out of a big bottle.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, when you're doing that, each time you're penetrating that, vial, you're potentially putting, bacteria or fungi from the air into the vial. So that once a vial is punctured the first time, you can't guarantee it's sterile, even if it was sterile up to that point. And sterility in vaccines, because we're injecting them, is absolutely essential, right? So we've put a lot of work into that. But with a multi-dose vial, because they're going into it repeatedly, you can't guarantee sterility. So they had to put a preservative in there that would stop any bacteria or fungi growing in that vial while they were using it. So it was in multi-dose vials. In Australia, in about the 70s and 80s, there was discussion about, was this a good thing or not? There was never a full consensus, but overall there was a feeling, look, if we can get it out of the vaccine, it will probably make people happier.
So there was public concern because everybody looked at mercury.
Well,
as
again,
it is
mercury
a poisonous thing,
caused some
right?
major problems in Japan. They had all the poisoning from the fish, and so there'd been some big mercury scares which had caused terrible, chronic disease in populations.
From the tuna, not from the vaccines, or
no, not from the vaccines. So
Okay.
there'd been, and this is where RFK comes from, is mercury from industry contaminating water supplies, contaminating food supplies, and poisoning people. And unfortunately, in the last 100 years, there have been some massive mercury poisonings, usually from industry, pumping out mercury and getting into people, whether through the fish or through other exposures, and then those people getting debilitating chronic disease.
Yeah.
So that's how we know mercury is highly toxic.
So was there studies showing that it's bad in vaccines, though?
No. So that's where, there was certainly no definitive data. In fact, if anything, the weight of the data suggested that what was being given in the vaccines, which was a very, very small dose, was not causing harm, right?
What about the blood-brain barrier thing?
Well, again, yeah, just put that aside. Let's get to where the vaccine industry was. So the vaccine industry, again, is trying to do the best thing. And so when concerns get raised, such as about mercury, you know, they'll look to see, well, is there any evidence that is really, would suggest this is harmful? And obviously, if they don't find that evidence, then you have two choices. You either say, oh, well, we don't find any evidence, so we're just going to leave it in there. But what more commonly happens is, well, we haven't shown it's harmful. We're aware the community, that there are some people in the community, including RFK, who obviously have concerns about it. We're not sure they're legitimate, but they have concerns. Sort of to protect the vaccines, let's try and move away from the use of mercury. So Australia was one of the first countries to do that. So we stopped using multi-dose flu vaccines like 30 years ago. We went to single shot, where your flu vaccine comes in a syringe.
And there's
no mercury in that. Because
what do they use? Do they have preservative that's
no,
used
there's
in
no
surrogate?
preservative.
Okay.
Because you don't need a preservative. If it's a single dose, you just pack it in a sterile syringe or a sterile vial. It's only ever opened once. There's no opportunity. And so they deliberately actually decided back then, as a policy, they would go to single dose, what we call single dose vaccines. And they did that in Australia. We were one of the first adopters in the world, right?
Go Australia.
Yeah, no.
Good on us.
I mean, there's still some vaccines in Australia that are in multi-dose because they're very rare ones, like rabies vaccine, which we import. And so, some of those may still have mercury in them, thiamersal, but very few.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly not the vaccines we're giving to children here. So they quietly moved away from putting it in. That wasn't necessarily an admission that it was harmful. And this is where, because again, the people say, they secretly took it out because they knew it was harmful. It wasn't that. It was a risk-benefit assessment. Like, look, we can't show a distinct risk, but we accept that if it's possible to make a vaccine without having mercury in it, let's do that regardless, because that's probably a good thing. So again, the vaccine industry isn't an evil monster.
And I'm not trying to say that. No, but I know you're prefacing.
But
okay, so what about that blood-brain barrier with the monkey then? Like, does that not show that it's a bit sus?
No, well, again, when you have to drill down the science, so you can set up studies to show different things, but you have to look at it holistically, at the weight of evidence. Do we know what happens when that mercury goes to the brain? What's a safe level of mercury in the brain? These things are really hard to answer.
Fair enough. And do we have an answer for is there a safe level of mercury to have in your brain? Because
well, again, environmental protection agencies, and again, RFK, this is his background.
Yeah,
they try and set limits. What's the average daily acceptable exposure to mercury? All right, so they have all these limits. You say, are those limits really accurate? No, I mean they're best guess. Like, because how do you prove that if you have 1 million people and you expose them to 4 parts per million mercury, that they'll all respond the same way? They're all different. They're different sizes. They have different metabolisms. They're eating other different chemicals. So when regulators set limits of any sort, they're not saying, look, it's perfectly safe below this limit. And
but it comes back to what you were saying
above
before
this limit
about the statistical significance.
Yeah. So this is what I'm trying to tell you is that again, they try to do as good a job as they can, and some people will disagree with that. And so RFK might say, but I think the limits that they were accepting are too high, and he's entitled to that.
But what does the science say?
Well, again, the science doesn't give a definitive answer because it can't. You cannot say what is the safe level of mercury for every person on this planet. You can say on average, most people seem to tolerate this amount of mercury, but I can't say there's not some rare person whose kidneys are not working, who's that is going to be too much mercury.
Mm.
And there's no way to do that science. It's
Mm.
like we can't do studies on the 7 or 8 billion people on this planet, monitoring every one of them and the
Yeah,
input.
of course.
So
of course.
science is an approximation, particularly when you're talking about, these types of things. And that's why then suddenly the public health people get very protective, because they're going, a crazy could come in here and destroy everything we've built up over decades, which is trying to balance risk and benefit. And they'll say, no, there's no level of any of these things that are acceptable. Well, one, that's impossible to achieve, but two, that might destroy all of the beneficial drugs and vaccines that we have.
Well, if we're talking about mercury, it was possible to achieve no mercury.
It
Right?
was with
the
effort and
single-
cost and cost.
Yeah, of course.
And in fact,
we were able to do it.
I guess where, and I take his point on this. So Australia was a wealthy country. So we, made a decision, the government, and they were happy to bear the cost of that effectively through CSL, that they went to single dose influenza. And, we've been using that cost, because, the cost of putting each vaccine in a single dose is a lot more expensive. Believe me, I know that cost. Dramatically more expensive than putting in a multi-dose vial. So
Makes sense.
we could afford it.
Glass cost.
Well, it's
And
not
the
just
sterile process.
But in any event, that was so rich countries could do that. Now he then says, but we're still selling, multi-dose vials in India and poorer countries. And so he did raise that in his interview, but
yeah, well, I heard the Bill Gates did that with polio, and then now they've found more polio vaccine strain from the polio. No, other way around. Polio from the vaccine is bigger than the issue of polio in India, and India outlawed the Bill Gates vaccine for polio. Is that correct?
No. So again,
I mean, there's nuance, and that's why I'm asking.
No, there's
I don't
nuance
know
to
the
everything, and it's important to get it right. So there's two types of polio vaccines, right? There's a live vaccine, which is a live virus.
Yeah.
Okay. And there's a killed vaccine, so a dead virus.
And that's the one that needed for the multi-dose.
So
mercury.
Live vaccines, you can't put mercury in because that would kill the virus.
Yeah.
All right. So where the vaccines in multi-dose vials that had mercury in them were not live virus. So measles, mumps, rubella, live viruses, there's no mercury. All right. So we need to get that straight. So it was like the tetanus and the killed polio, pertussis, these types of vaccines that in the multi-dose that had the mercury. And obviously if they're being used in multi-dose vials, there are other preservatives. So, you can use like phenol and, alcohol, in fact, but unfortunately that's pretty painful to inject. Some of the rabies vaccines have these things in them, and people, say they're pretty painful. So they do have alternatives.
Yeah,
so the beauty of the mercury, and you have to remember, we all were having mercury fillings, people in my generation.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah. Okay.
So all our teeth were full of mercury.
Wild. That sounds.
Now people fill with wider resins. And,
that's what I've got.
And in fact, some people are having their old fillings drilled out because they believe they're being poisoned by the mercury in their fillings. I think that's going to an extreme.
I don't know.
Again, those mercury amalgam fillings are being used for, probably 100 years. So, and people have lived with them all their lives. So, again, the idea, and this comes back to your question, like I'm sure, RFK would say, those people are dying who've got, mercury fillings. Well, anyone over 60 years of age on this planet will all be carrying mercury fillings, and probably a lot more mercury than maybe in the vaccine. So
Well, I guess there's a difference. I don't know. It depends
Again, it's
whether it
in a
would get
different
into your
form
whether it
and
get into
like,
your
no,
brain,
yeah.
whether where it sits, does it just sit there? Does it leak out? Does it have a
But this is
protective
why
case?
but this is why I'm saying there's so many nuances. It's just not black and white, and I
Of
think
course not.
it's important to distinguish. So with polio,
Yeah.
the issue with polio, which we've recognised for a long time, is that the live polio, which is the oral one, you just as kids we got it on a they gave us a sugar cube, and they put the polio, which is the virus, on the sugar cube, and then we just swallowed it. All right. So unfortunately, because it is a live virus, that can actually cause polio,
Yes.
right?
Makes sense.
It as a virus, it can mutate back to the wild, what we call the wild type. So because if you're using the the oral live virus polio vaccine, you'll always have polio. You'll have much less polio, but because you're actually putting it back into the environment, the virus, because you're excreting it, then other people can get infected by that vaccine virus that someone else has excreted, and now get polio.
Yeah.
So you can reduce polio, but you can't eradicate it using that live vaccine. So now we're all moving to inactivated, and again, Australia did this donkeys years ago, because again, we're generally leading the world in a lot of these areas, where we've moved from using the oral to only using the inactivated. The inactivated can't cause polio. So if everyone on the planet goes to inactivated, there should be no polio, because there's no animal reservoir. So the only place polio can come from currently is from the oral live vaccine, believe it or not.
Yeah, okay.
And
So
so
Bill was using
that's
that.
why Bill Gates and everyone are working to move all the world from using oral, and oral's a lot cheaper and easier to make. So that's, again, it's more expensive to move to the inactivated. And obviously then if it's inactivated, if it's in a multi-dose vial, it may have mercury. Again, I haven't looked at all the different brands being made in India to know.
Fair enough.
But so again, there's always a context around all these things, and it's always a risk benefit. And so we can't separate those two things out.
Okay, well, let me get to the other bit that he said. He said, where was it? Okay, so the Lazarus study by the CDC used a testing machine counting system of cluster analysis, and they found that fewer than 1 out of 100 vax injuries are reported. That was that was the premise of the study, that fewer than 1 out of 100 vaccine injuries are reported because it relies on voluntary reporting.
Yeah.
But the Lazarus study by the CDC with their cluster analysis using machine analysis found that 1 out of 37 kids were getting potential vaccine injuries. However, that can't be proven because it's a statistical analysis.
So again, this is conflating, I think, different sources of information. So
I don't know. That's just what he said was related to that particular study.
So the particular study we're citing is that, again, back in the sort of 70s, it was felt that there was a need, because prior to that, basically, you got your vaccine got approved and it got rolled out, and that was the end of it. So you didn't collect any information. But with various lobbying and desire to have more data, the government set up what they call passive reporting system, which is people could report a vaccine injury. And because they're passive, there's no requirement on anyone to report it. So obviously, if it's a mild, you get a vaccine, you have a sore arm, most people aren't going to bother to report it.
Yeah, but that would be included as an adverse event, would it?
Well, yeah, it is. Everything that occurs that wouldn't have occurred if you hadn't received the vaccine is an adverse event. This is where, again, you have to be really careful. And that's why we have placebo control. So when we, in the phase 3 trial, we're jabbing people with saline, just salt water. Some of those will get incredible side effects.
they're
Some will say,
freaking
"Oh,
out.
my arm's been falling off for a week." All right, like because some of it is psychological.
Yeah.
All right,
Fair.
some of it may just be the fear of needles or the trauma, like the anxiety. So they'll say, "Oh, I had, my heart was racing for days after I had it," and it, so that's why you need a placebo.
Yeah, well,
It's
'cause
so
there's some
important,
pussies out there.
right? So everything that occurs after a vaccination is considered a vaccine adverse event, and that's why you will also get vaccine adverse events in the placebo group, and then you subtract them. So that's
Mhm.
why the phase 3 is so important, because now you have what you might call the real adverse events.
Yeah.
All right, because you're subtracting the non-real adverse events in the control arm. When you have a passive reporting system, you don't have a placebo, so you don't have that opportunity. So there's two sides to passive reporting systems. One is that a lot of people aren't going to bother to report it, all right, or aren't going to know to report it, or haven't got the time to report it, all right. And so that creates what we call an underreporting factor.
Yeah.
And everyone accepts it's real, like it's been proved, and it's obvious, so logical and obvious,
Mm.
right? And people have tried to calculate what that is. Now, the interesting thing is it varies according to the type of side effect. So if it's a side effect that, say, doctors are very aware of, they're much more likely to report it than if it's something that, they wouldn't normally think of as related to a vaccine.
Like a headache or a
Uh,
migraine.
well, yeah, like, say someone comes in with a sore toe and they've had a vaccine 2 weeks ago. The doctor's not going to connect the sore toe with the vaccine. The vaccine's given up here, the sore toe down there. You've probably stubbed your toe. He's not going to report it. He's not going to make an association. Now, it may turn out that there is some weird vaccine side effect, affects the circulation in your toe, and it causes sore toes, but it won't get reported because it will be missed because there's no obvious link. All right.
And he probably wouldn't even go to the doctor for that.
And you may not go to the doctor. All right.
Yeah.
So that underreporting factor is not consistent.
Yep.
So he calculated it as a factor of 100.
Mm-hmm.
But even when you look into that, it's not that serious adverse events were underreported by 100 and sore arms were underreported by 100. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so most people would say the overall underreporting factor may be a factor of 10, it may be a factor of 20, but for some things it may be a factor of 100. All right. So there is an underreporting
But for the
side of
serious
it.
things.
But then you have the other side, which is what, the people arguing with RFK say, but because there's no placebo, you need to subtract out all of the things that are happening after vaccination that actually have nothing to do with the vaccine that you would see in a placebo group if they were being compared. So you have to now take that off. So you have to rebalance it. You have to correct for this underreporting, but don't forget to also correct for reporting of things that actually have no connection to the vaccine. And so that means most people in the field, I guess, would say, well, passive reporting systems are a waste of time. They were done to keep everyone happy, but they really aren't very good sources of information. So there are what we call active reporting systems, which are different. So that's where you say everyone who's getting a vaccine gets given a phone app, and then the app reminds them every week to tell whether they got symptoms or not. So it's actively seeking them to tease out, have they had any side effects? When you give those sort of active things, you get a much higher rate of side effects than you do with the passive systems, by orders of magnitude.
Yeah, okay.
They still again have to, you'd have to work out a way to correct them for the side effects you'd get after a placebo. So they're better at eliciting side effects, but again, a lot of the side effects they elicit may not actually be connected to the vaccine.
Yeah, okay.
So all these systems have terrible problems on all sides, and so they're not, and that's why we need phase 3 clinical trials are so important, because ultimately we don't have anything else. I mean, these other systems, a lot of us would say they're next to useless. And that's the truth. because they're misused more than they're properly used.
Yeah, because I noticed during the COVID times that everybody was quoting the VAERS
Yeah.
study, the VAERS reporting, and it's 10
Yeah.
times more. And then I guess the industry or the official narrative was, no, it's not actually being underreported this time because everybody's focusing on it. So I guess we don't know. Do we?
And so so unfortunately you end up with a situation, where you have to discount the value of it from all directions.
So if we discount the value of that, just to go back to COVID, where are we? Where are we standing? We found out so far that the clinical studies were kind of a waste of time because they had no statistical significance.
No,
in
they
terms
weren't a
of,
waste of time. They showed that the vaccines had a very important effect on symptomatic infection. All right, so they were reducing symptomatic infections. We didn't measure whether they were stopping all infections, because there's also what we call asymptomatic infections, which are infections where you don't know you've got it, but you can still pass it on. And it turns out that overall the vaccines weren't that good at stopping that, and that's why the vaccines didn't stop transmission. Any claim that the vaccine stopped transmission is, again, complete false.
So we shouldn't
they
have
didn't
locked ourselves in our rooms and stayed in our houses then.
Well, no, again, that the situation we had. I mean, if you're trying to eradicate a virus, and again, this is where there's no right or wrong answer. It's all relative to the situation. So, if you look at what happened with the original SARS coronavirus, so 2003, we had an outbreak. It was much more lethal. So 1 in 10 people who got it, including young, healthy nurses, doctors, died. 1 in 10.
That's a lot.
Right? I mean, with COVID, we're talking basically 0.01%, and mainly people over 80. Here we're talking 10% young, healthy people were dying of SARS. We didn't have vaccines. In fact,
you made one.
We made a successful one after the event.
But it didn't have the transmissibility to continue going.
Well, no, it was transmissible, but because it was such a nasty virus, that enormous efforts were put into basically identifying people who had been exposed and locking them all down, putting them into isolation.
Yeah, but that's the fundamental idea.
And they eradicated it because they did it early. And anyone who says, "Oh, you couldn't have done that with COVID," again, that's a nonsense. Australia did it. We actually went from having, community transmission at reasonably large scale, thousands of people in Australia infected. We actually eradicated it completely. I mean, everyone seems to forget. We achieved that without vaccines by using these strategies of if someone's a contact, trace the contacts, isolate the contacts, stop the viral transmission, right? Not necessarily lock down the community, because I think, again, there's two, and this is where people confuse the issue. When you have small numbers of events, in the hundreds or even thousands, right? You can identify all of the individuals who are infected. You can identify everyone who's been in contact with them, all right? And they are the people who need to be locked up, not the community. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, you quarantine people that are infected.
Yeah.
That's the point.
You
That's
take
what they
them
do
out
with
of the community.
That's what they did with all the serious.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah.
And that is incredibly.
That's what you see in the movies,
And it takes a lot of work, right? But it's incredibly effective, and that's how we eradicated SARS. So we knew we could do this for a coronavirus. So just putting it in context, we successfully eradicated SARS from the planet. Well, from humans.
COVID-1.
We still don't know where it came from entirely, but we eradicated it from humans, and it hasn't come back. Amazing success story, not talked about enough. No vaccine. So come to COVID. Well, why didn't the same thing happen for COVID? At the original outbreak, that virus was no more transmissible than SARS. So technically, we should have been able to eradicate it globally, just like we did SARS.
But
politics.
yeah, China didn't
But
tell us,
global
right?
politics. Well, a mixture of things. It was in the middle of, a lot of conflict between US and China. They weren't getting along, a lot of friction, trade wars. And, and then the US administration under Trump announced that they were taking all their money out of WHO because the US was a big funder of
Yeah.
WHO, and they announced they're pulling the lot.
Yeah, well, they were number one, right? And then Bill Gates was number 2.
Something like that. But
Yeah.
but in any event, and this is all happening pre the pandemic, just before the
Yeah.
pandemic. The timing is impeccable, right? So and China had offered to fill the hole in the WHO budget that was going to be created by the US pulling all their money out. All right. So this is a scenario going into the outbreak. So basically, rather than everyone working on the same page, everyone getting together under the umbrella, say, of WHO, which is meant to be, that's their role, right, to bring all the different countries together to say, right, let's get in here, let's sort this outbreak, work out what's going on, isolate everyone, close it down, and eradicate it.
Yeah, like quarantine in the traditional sense of what quarantine means, which is track, trace those that are infected.
Yeah, right at the
source.
The source of the outbreak in Wuhan.
Yes.
Right.
Or wherever it may be.
But, in this case, it was Wuhan. So
Yes.
that's where it was.
True.
Right.
The institute.
But rather than that happen, well, obviously that's a whole other story.
Yeah, we'll continue with this one.
But in any event, that clearly that should have happened. But what happened instead? The Chinese, for whatever reason, denied that it was a serious outbreak was happening. They didn't welcome other people in to assist or to investigate. They got the WHO and they fed WHO a lot of false information, right? So they fed information which wasn't true, and in fact their own doctors later contradicted and said that wasn't what we told the government. They told them there was no human-to-human transmission because, of course, if there was no human-to-human transmission, it's not really a major worry. It's going to be easy to shut down.
I remember seeing that Chinese girl that was trying to be super vocal about it, and we've never seen her since.
As I say, a lot of things have happened in 3 years, but essentially there was a deliberate campaign of misinformation, and unfortunately that misinformation was fed to the world through the CDC, who were trying to stay on side with China more than I would argue they were interested in pursuing the actual truth of the matter.
So the
they
CDC
put out,
or the WHO?
WHO. Yeah. I mean, CDC came in a bit later with their own failures and because again,
for testing and
for the PCR testing and getting
tests
on top of it in the US.
Yeah.
And again, the other big narrative that came out of the WHO, which broke their own policy on outbreaks, was they said there should be no interruption of flights in and out of China, and that countries shouldn't shut their borders.
The WHO said that, and
they said that
shouldn't have said that.
No, because their own rule book says the first thing you do to control outbreak is you totally stop all movement of people in and out of the outbreak zone. So if the outbreak zone is China, you stop all movement of people in and out of China. If the outbreak zone is just Wuhan, you stop all movement of people in and out of Wuhan. That's in the rule book. Like that's the WHO rule book.
But
suddenly, suddenly because they're under pressure, because presumably China's saying, do you want $500 million or don't you? And so you have WHO, which every country in the world is looking up to, saying, suddenly, you shouldn't be stopping movement of people, in and out of this outbreak zone. And we can assure you it's not transmissible human to human. Complete and utter, falsehoods, both of them. So no one really intervened early enough. I know Australia and the US, by February got cold feet and just said, we're just shutting flights, but it was too late.
Yeah, but that was March, right?
Yeah, it was
like
sort of
March
February through March.
Yeah.
Countries started to But
I remember looking at the
by
stock
then, of
market.
course, it had all gone to Africa, and all thanks to, unfortunately, WHOs. They screwed up.
So, WHO, World Pandemic Treaty. What do you reckon?
Yeah, look, they didn't. They don't come out of this pandemic, looking great. Unfortunately, I think they are a well-respected organisation, but again, I think the politics, and again, it's not their fault. I mean, they had this war going on with the US trying to essentially destroy the WHO, right? This is pre-pandemic, and China coming in and looking to use WHO for influence as part of its war or trade war, whatever you want to call it, with the US.
Yeah.
So WHO sort of ends up the bunny in the middle. So in the midst of all that politics, they got things wrong, and I think really hurt their reputation, which isn't to say that WHO is not a legitimate organization and an important organization. And again, never throw the baby out with the bathwater, but by God, they need to be sorted out. They need to have their own inquiries and come clean and say, look, we screwed up for all these reasons, some of which were outside our control and some of them were within our control. But we shouldn't have done it this way, and we admit we shouldn't have done it that way, right? Until they do that, I find it, I can't see how can anyone trust them. Because you know what I mean?
Well,
until
that's just
they
any
own
relationship,
up,
right? That's any
yeah,
relationship.
exactly.
Yeah, that's just the basics.
Exactly.
Like, if I knew you cheated and you haven't confessed to it, I'm not going to trust you.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And you have to earn the trust back.
Oh, of course.
I think that WHO pushing these agendas on the back of what I think is a failed response to this pandemic,
terrible timing,
is absolutely dreadful timing. It's almost like they're hoping that the noise that is created by this sort of takes over from people looking at what happened at the beginning.
However, to touch on that previous battle that I think is definitely, that argument is still going on, right? So the US, by the sounds of it, was saying, we don't want to be a part of this. And then China was saying, let's be a part of it, which is kind of like the idea of a globalist or nationalist identity for health or for these big bodies. It sounds like that the US or under Trump wanted to say, let's be nationalists, let's be a more sovereign nation and
absolutely.
take care of everything ourselves.
Yeah, that is the US.
Yeah, and that's
over the last 100 years. They've often been isolationist and focused on very much internally. Yeah,
that's it's had its benefits and it's had its costs.
Yeah.
And the UK did a similar thing with Brexit, and it looks like the world's kind of slowly moving towards that in our sentiment because we lost trust with this global identity. However, there are a few things that are in that pandemic treaty in terms of the wording that they're using or the wording they're taking out more so. And I'm going to paraphrase this, so I might butcher this, but I saw this from a great guy that I'm hoping to have on the podcast soon. He's from Canada and he's been looking at rather closely. And they're taking out essentially the line that goes along the lines of valuing human life and human rights and human liberty and stuff like that. And they're taking out that paragraph and they're just making it about human equity, which is a little concerning. It's concerning.
Yeah, equity is that everyone interprets it differently. It's not something that you can easily measure. And it's sort of qualitative assessment, whereas I think liberty you can measure.
What's the difference?
Liberty.
So if people go, okay, what's the difference? What is human equity? Like, what does that even mean?
Well, you'd probably have to ask the WHO what that means, but I guess their constituents are the majority, a bit like the United Nations, which they sort of are part of. Are predominantly poorer countries. They form the vast majority of countries. Obviously, the wealthier countries are in the minority. So if they base it on numbers of their constituents, not necessarily who's funding them, but who are the members, of course, they would be lean towards how do we improve the health of those countries relative to the wealthy countries? So that would involve doing a rebalancing, and
I'm not quite
but how that
clear on what
might
you're
play
saying.
out in health is I guess what might concern people.
I don't know what you mean. Can you explain that in a different way?
All right. Well, say most of their constituents are in Africa, just by number.
Yeah.
So, and their biggest problem is malnutrition.
Mm.
And then they have a small number of constituents, like the US and Australia, whose problem is probably overnutrition.
Mm.
So they intervene to say, well, we're going to take calories from these people; they don't need them, and on equity basis, and also it's causing them harm, and we're going to redistribute all those calories to these countries that need them to improve their health. They could do that.
That sounds
Well, that
sounds
and how they
worrying.
would do that, like how they would move all the grain from the US to Africa or whatever. And
I mean, that's essentially
that would be that's
this.
where health and and I guess RFK, he must support that, because he said, malnutrition is the biggest cause of infectious disease,
Which
even more than vaccines. And
Well,
so
he's saying that the
suddenly the
studies said that,
WHO
yeah.
might have a platform where they say we have a right to intervene in the food supply and who gets what food.
Well, that's communist.
Now, but it could be done under equity, health equity.
Yeah, it's a new word.
but and that's where I think the people have a right to say, well, how far does it extend?
Mm.
In other words, when we're just talking about health, I think people think, well, individual health, do they have access to antibiotics if they have an infection? But they're not thinking about health in terms of the world's food supply or the world's water supply. If WHO truly have the power to create equity in health, that will mean redistributing the water, redistributing the food. I mean, that's what it means. I'm not saying that's what they're intending, but it would give them the power to do that, because food ultimately is the biggest driver of good health.
I have never thought, well, it's not that I've never thought about that in general, but I haven't thought about that angle for the pandemic treaty at all. And that is terrifying.
It shouldn't be terrifying. You should just think about all of the what this might cover, and do you need to exclude some things? Like, do you need to put some provisos? It goes so far and not beyond. It's a bit like under cover of a pandemic, if you have a right to, lock people up and, close borders and do, what power might that give? So you've got a war going on. Could you use the pandemic and what, is arguably being done for health reasons to advantage one or other party at war? Do you know what I mean? By creating limit. And so this is where we have to be careful. I do think the WHO needs to be focused on health. There should be other bodies who look at some of these other inequities that clearly exist on the planet.
Yeah, of course.
But I don't know that it's the WHO's province. I think, again, we should define what they mean by health.
Yes.
And everyone be aware of what the outer bounds of that are. And similarly, what powers are you devolving to them? Absolutely. I mean, it's a balancing act, isn't it, between retaining national powers and devolving some of those powers to international bodies. That can be beneficial. It can also be harmful.
That's why I'm more into individualism as like the basis of like how we go about building society, which is like, how can we assist the individual create the best life possible for themselves, not as it's good for the collective means, because that's what America was founded on, which is like it's the individual liberties and freedoms, not freedoms of the group. Because when you have freedoms of the group, they say you must, for example, in this, you shouldn't have all this food in your country because it's good, it's for the greater good. And then you go, well, there's a lot of things that have been done throughout history for the greater good, um, that have not turned out well.
Yeah, but there have been things done that have turned out well. So we have to be careful. Again, there is a need for um, some collective policies as opposed to individual policies. It's a balancing act. There's no
Yeah,
such thing
fair.
as absolutes.
Fair.
But we have to get that balance right, and be we can't afford for it to go too far one way, in which case we have anarchy, or
Yes.
too far the other way, in which we have a totalitarian system. You know what I mean? And,
Yeah, I do.
trying to find that middle ground and that balance is difficult, and it's different country to country and culture to culture.
Some cultures need a king.
Well, yeah, and some
And
cultures thrive on organization and sort of lots of rules.
yeah, like Germany's super organized.
Yeah, I mean,
They're very organized
Japan,
society.
I mean,
Japan,
very
yeah.
structured society.
Yeah.
Australia typically has been at the other extreme, which is, I would say, having grown up, we were quite free. Like, I mean, we've got more constrained, I think, over time.
Yeah, or as we call it here, the nanny state.
Yeah, unfortunately, that has happened, and I think we need to go back to finding some more of that, what we were famous for as a country, which is that ochre spirit and that sense that people can just be people. They don't have to be politically correct. They can break the rules. I mean,
dance on the bar.
Yeah,
we have to worry about like, health and safety every moment of the day.
And again, it's a balance. It's a balancing act, but I don't think a nanny state is the answer to anything. Yes, we do need rules and regulations and some but we do need a lot of sense of individual freedom within that.
Yeah, well, you need enough rules to be a civilized society.
Yes, exactly.
So then we can all work together for business sake, and we can construct things and build a better society. So we can have all of our fundamental utilities and amenities and be able to have a business and be able to have a family and be able to afford that and do life, right? That's why we need the rules, but because without them, that's a lot harder. Having an energy grid's a lot harder in anarchy, I would presume.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, and what the way I would see it, and I think this is where they've got it wrong.
Who's they?
Is the policy makers, the politicians largely.
Yeah.
The legislators,
of Australia,
because they create all the laws, and there's more, and there's more, and there's more, and there's more. I can tell you over my lifetime, like, just outrageous. The number of
adding and no subtracting.
There's been very little subtracting. There's been a lot of adding, and if what they need to do is get the community, or it's like almost the opposite of what they're doing. So at the moment they're saying, well, people aren't respectful enough of minorities or this or that, so we're going to legislate this and this and this and this and this. We're going to tie the whole of society down because of a few renegades who push the boundaries. All right. What you would normally, a better system and what I think we operate under past is, if we can control our own renegades, we should need no laws whatsoever. In other words, society itself should police the people who are racist or whatever, should be shut down by the people around them. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Without needing any laws. Because laws they don't solve the problem, and they affect everybody. Generally, most people who are affected by it aren't the people who were actually causing the trouble. Yeah. So I think the idea of self-policing, it's like in the classroom. The teacher, if the classroom policed itself, the teacher didn't have to be there. Do you know what I mean? And nor did he have to have draconian rules. If I catch you doing this, this is the consequence, because the classroom policed itself, because they knew they had a lot of freedom as a consequence of creating their own boundaries.
And so I think the responsibility of having freedom, right? With great power comes great responsibility. Shout outs to Spider-Man. or Spider-Man's uncle or grandfather, whoever it was.
Okay. I
You've
didn't
seen
realize it was so profound a comic, but
it's so profound. But yeah, that's exactly the point, right? Is that we have boundaries, but they're further away. We build things like manners.
mm,
We teach our
yeah,
kids them.
yeah.
But I think there's also another like interplay in a society level that's happened that we aren't as uh, able to raise our kids as much because it's moved more into the state's hand with everybody. Everybody's working now, right? We can't afford to not work or not have everybody working. In a home, like you need both mum and dad for the most part. For just an average family, obviously, if you build wealth creation techniques and you can get out of the rat race. But for the most part, right now, it's like everybody needs to be in work. So you can't be there and teach your kid all those values and your values. Then they go to school and they might not respect the school teacher as much because it's not their parents. They don't have that fundamental genetic and spiritual connection to, oh my God, I want to be like you do with your parents. So it's kind of like that's a big interplay.
No, absolutely. And I think, as you say, the changing societal norms, have dramatically changed over the last 40 years in Australia,
Yeah.
and as you say, the fact that both parents now are often full-time work, is completely
Yeah.
different to where it was 40 years ago.
Yeah. And also, just to preface it, it's not to say that like we should then go, oh, so that means, should we get rid of women working? No, of course not. No, there's women
No.
can fulfill things and
Yeah.
they have a lot to add to society and to people and create and, spiritual beings. Like they're very competent.
But
But we need
it's
to
more
find something.
how you have to realize society's changed. So how do we remold society
That we
around
Yeah.
modern life? We didn't have the internet. We didn't have mobile phones. we when we were
Yeah.
growing up, lucky to have television. So,
Yeah.
but those things have all had massive impacts. But we haven't restructured our society
Mm.
really to accommodate those things and work out how to get the best out of them while not losing, what we had before. You know what I
And
mean? And
I
and
do.
that requires rethinking. And the trouble is, it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of thought.
Yeah.
And I think what we now have in our policymakers, to be frank, is laziness. And I think even with COVID, what we saw was an enormous amount of laziness. Well, let's just lock down the whole state
Not
rather
only
than have to think about, how do we, test and isolate and control this through normal processes. It's just like a laziness. Oh, just pass a law and say no one can leave their
Well, it's
house.
not only that, it was, let's each, for the most part, the leaders were like, oh, I'm doing what this unelected bureaucrat says we should do that doesn't work in the industry.
Yeah, and so
that
this
as well.
I would call it all laziness.
Yeah, well, that's
That
fair.
that it's the easy thing to do. It's not necessarily the best thing to do or the right thing to do. And generally, the best thing and right thing, as my parents always taught me, is often the hard thing.
Mm.
You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
well, as they say, if you want something done right, you got to do it yourself.
Mm.
You don't always want to do it yourself.
No. So I think that we do need people to take more responsibility. And we need to somehow instill that into our society. There's an expectation of people taking responsibility.
Mm.
And in return, what we're given is more freedom.
Yeah.
You see, right? Rather than being told, that we're going to get less and less freedom, there has to be a benefit from people taking responsibility, because otherwise people aren't going to do it.
Yeah.
So you have to say to the community, look, we really need you all to step up. We need you to, be civil to each other, to work together, to have common goals, to be good people. You know what I mean?
I do. I agree.
And then we can get rid of all of this because all these crazy rules are just ridiculous, and they don't serve a purpose, and they're very constraining. And it doesn't make it an enjoyable place to live. I mean, the great thing about Australia was, it used to be a fun place to live because long as, again, everyone,
It was moral, just, and integral.
Like
it worked.
you could have a bit of craziness, or you could do something that maybe you shouldn't have, but it was a tolerant system because it could be, because there was still an expectation people are good. And people were good.
And
like,
they did.
It's like letting your kids, like as kids, we roamed freely the town. And
I did. I was lucky. I had pretty free range parents. That were like, kind of do what you need to do with life. Like, go out on your bikes. Like, we would go all around Adelaide, like on our bikes, just cruising around different skate parks and all that. And it was good fun. Sometimes you'd be like, oh wow, there's these hectic stuff going on. And, we would naturally, as a friendship group, just go, all right, let's get out of here. Because, you're not going to just go up to, I don't know, people, crackheads, and be like, hey, what's going on? Like, no. You can police yourself. You can bail.
I think, that's what we're losing. And we don't realize how much we've lost. Would someone let a 5-year-old, walk 4 blocks to go to the shop these days by themselves?
No, they wouldn't now. Everybody go, they're going to be stolen. I remember, just a fun little anecdote. I remember I went down to Bowden on my bike, the suburb.
No, I don't know Bowden.
Oh, okay. So it's just past North Adelaide, one suburb over. It's super gentrified, really nice now. But back then it was kind of Darrow. And I was with my friend and I was like, let's go back this way. He's like, no, it's this way. Then we split because we were strong-headed. Right. And be like, I'm going to go this way, you're going to go that way. We'll see who gets back first. Anyway, I was like 7 and I got lost. And I'm just on the street crying. I got let in by lovely people in the area. But then, I had to call my mama. But people wouldn't allow that these days.
No.
They would. I mean, my parents were obviously concerned because I was getting called from a random person in a different suburb. But, it worked out.
But again, I mean, people were good people. And why were they good people? Why do we have so many bad people now?
Well,
do you know what I mean?
Do we have more bad people, or is it the media that has over-exemplified this? And I don't know, what are the crime rate differences? Are they different?
It's a good question. And again, science, you should go, as you say.
I might have to get someone on that knows.
Yeah.
We need to bring back good people if they're not already there. I feel like we're all getting swept up in these hive minds.
I just don't know, and maybe, people talk about faith and religions and, again, that was obviously a lot more evident back then. Not that everyone was religious.
No, but there was definitely...
But I think everyone had even people who might be, say, an atheist, still had a sense of faith or in the virtues of people, and we seem to have lost that, as you say. And whether the media have played a role in arguing everyone's an evil person inside, you know what I mean? And maybe that creates evil in people.
Well, I have learnt from the personal development I've done that let's use the example of a close loved one. The way you see them, it's like an always listening. So if you're already listening to them and always listening to them in a certain frame of mind. So if I look at you and I go, oh, Nikolai is always angry, he always pops
probably
up.
Am too.
but if I think of you like that,
I'll become like that.
Naturally, you're just going to be like that more in my presence because I'm then
you're projecting
that onto you. So definitely the listening we have of one another is a big thing. And I guess from a more, if we look at religions, they try to preach, love thy neighbor as thy friend or something of the like across the board. They go, you're another person. And then, you look at the spiritual side and those that go into psychedelics and all that. The same message. They all go, we're all connected. We're all one, man. I love you, John Lennon, same thing. All we need is love. We just need to treat each other like we are one another.
And I think, that's what, we've lost in a way, particularly in this pandemic, when you look at the different sides and then you realize that none of them are prepared to come and, well, they're certainly not prepared to debate, even when they're offered a lot of money to. But it
was offered to charity. I didn't want to give to charity.
Right. But you see that we shouldn't be in that situation. I mean, we're all human. We're all trying to do something good.
Mm.
We might have different perspectives on it, but if we can get everyone together, we'll probably find we have more in common than we have different. And again, it's not that I think people within the vaccine industry don't even believe that some of the things RFK is saying don't have an element of truth. I mean,
Mm.
but what I mean? But they also don't want a situation where if they concede there's an element of truth, he will then use that as a weapon to go in even harder against things where he's actually got it wrong. And
Which
so
naturally you
that's a
would.
lack of trust, you see. And that's what I'm saying is that the reason you have these two polarized sides, neither wanting to give the other ammunition,
I mean,
right?
he's willing, right? He's willing.
Well,
He's willing
he
to sit down
says,
and talk.
yeah, but is he willing to give up his whole position? And if they convince him, is he willing to actually, concede vaccines are safe? Like, his body language doesn't say he's ready and willing to do that. He uses the words, "I can always be convinced."
Mm.
But
Well,
they and I again,
we gotta see. We
I'm
gotta wait and
being the
see.
devil's advocate.
True. Well,
Right?
maybe we should see if you can have that conversation for the
Yeah,
world because they obviously want to see it. And I'm
yeah.
sure people listening to this that have listened to that, you know, would have, whether they have more questions or they've gotten the answers that,
Mm,
go, oh, yeah, fair enough. Wherever they're going to sit, they're going to be better off now than they were before because nobody's even willing to answer those questions at all. So, like, first of all, I just want to say thank you for that portion of this conversation. And also thank you for the work you've done during this pandemic. We haven't really touched on that too
mm.
much. But look, you've done so many other podcasts that they can definitely find exactly what it is you have done with your vaccines. But I would like to just touch on that and just say, where are we at with yours? You're in
Yeah.
Iran. Are you else place around the world now, or?
So no, we got approved in Iran,
Mhm.
and I think 8 million doses were used. Obviously, by the end of that, everyone in Iran has had COVID. Well,
Yeah.
in fact, everyone on the planet. I mean, in truth, because we know the stats. I was just looking at the United Kingdom data just last week, and that was showing 90% of everyone in the UK has had COVID, and it's probably 100%. The 10% are just people who've lost their antibodies, but 90% of people were antibody positive. So basically, we can accept everyone on the planet has now had COVID at least once. Some people more than once. So a lot of the poorer countries, that's all they need. They're not pursuing additional doses of vaccine because
Mm.
they're going, we used the vaccines, we stopped, some deaths. Everyone's had COVID. Everyone's now got natural immunity. It's still there. It's still circulating, but we've got other bigger problems to deal with.
Yeah.
Um, so that's what's happening in the developing world.
Yeah.
Is
Okay.
the vaccine use has dropped to almost nothing. It's not good for us because our vaccine at the moment is just in that part of the world, not the part of the world that's still using it. We're pushing forward with our vaccine. So we're doing a next generation vaccine. There are still people dying of COVID, particularly the elderly.
Yeah.
Um, Despite having had 6 shots of mRNA. So we clearly need better vaccines.
Mm.
Um, you know, I would like to think ours is a good contender for that, particularly if we.
Well, you think that,
Um,
or you know that?
it's very hard to collect the data, and I know I can't give you a clear. I have a belief,
Yeah.
because I've seen people around me who've had it, and I've had it, and what's happened to us, but you can't do phase 3 trials anymore.
Because everybody's had the other one
Well, because
and COVID.
because everyone's had COVID and everyone's had all these multiple doses of vaccine, so it's not easy now. You don't have a clean population to do it in. We do a lot of animal studies still, so monkey studies where we can. Whenever we do that, we see great results. The monkeys are always protected, including against Omicron and things like that.
Yeah. Okay.
Still with our old vaccine.
Mm.
So, I mean, can monkeys lie? Like, can the monkey data lie? Well, possibly, but unlikely. I mean, monkeys are 99% genetically the same as humans. So we believe that's the best data that there is, and that says our vaccine is really good. So
And do
that's
you
why I have
do
that belief in it. But we are trying to make it even better. So we're putting in some new Omicron uh, proteins into it
Yeah, okay.
to make it even more effective. We're actually looking at doing it as an oral vaccine,
Like
not
a
as a live
saline
one,
or
but just as one you put in your mouth,
yeah,
like
okay.
you swallow.
Huh.
Um,
How does that
and
work?
well, you have a lot of immune cells in your mouth because that's where when your food it's a lot of food's full of bugs. That's the way most bugs get into your body. So the body has trained all of the cells around the mouth to watch out for bad bugs. Um, and so, as I mentioned, the live polio vaccine was an oral vaccine. So I mean that was a live one. We're using just a protein based one. But we've just done a monkey study and we've seen great data with that. So we'll be doing a human trial of an oral vaccine, hopefully here in the very near future.
Cool. And that's double blind and all that? Or
Yep.
yeah, okay.
So
Is it double blind with the monkeys as well? Like, do you give some
yeah,
monkeys
so you give
and
sub a
then they see
placebo.
each other and all that?
Yeah, so the monkeys, I mean, they don't know what they're getting, obviously,
No.
but you do give some monkeys a saline injection,
Yeah, okay.
and the other monkeys get the active one, and then they all get given the virus, and then you watch how they handle the virus, and we always see that.
What kind of monkeys?
So these are rhesus and cynomolgus macaques. They're
They're
sort
little.
of smaller monkeys.
Yeah.
Yeah, but they don't monkeys don't get so sick with COVID, which is interesting. Even when they're not
What
vaccinated.
about old monkeys?
Yeah, so we actually we've just published a paper on some very old monkeys. So macaques live to about 25 years of age. So that's about probably a 70, 80-year-old. So we did it, probably one of the only studies in the world that's been done with 20, 22-year-old macaques right back at the very beginning of this, and we saw great protection again. So again, we limit our animal testing because again it's all a balancing act, risk benefit. But obviously we can't challenge humans.
Mm.
But the data has been very positive with that, including with, as I say, this latest generation oral vaccines. We're hoping if we can get that out, and if we're right about it, that should be able to boost people no matter what other vaccine they've had in the past. And I think people would be a lot happier to have a 6 monthly boost with something that they just put in their mouth rather than getting jabbed with a needle. So
I think so. I think
yeah.
that's makes sense.
So as a vaccine developer, we never stop. We never give up. And then we've got outbreaks, obviously, of different bird flus happening around the world at the moment.
Okay.
So yeah, there's just been some reports again out of China and out of Asia and also out of the US of different types of bird flu.
They're
Any of
pretty
those?
severe?
They've infected humans, so that there's always influenza in birds, but
Mm.
it doesn't that often cross over to humans. So it has crossed over. When bird flu crosses to humans, it isn't always cause severe disease, but in these cases, people have died from it. So you never know like what's around the corner. So we're always trying to anticipate and have a vaccine ready for if there's a pandemic. It's better to be pre-prepared, and we just don't know where the next threat will come from.
How does that work from like a business point of view?
Terribly.
Like trying to get
You're
prepared for a
talking to
bunch of things
the
that
poorest vaccine developer in the world right now. We didn't get
yeah.
swamped with billions of dollars of government money, unlike all of our
No,
competitors.
which given the technology you're using and how tried and true it is, does seem uh absurd. Does seem
Yeah,
absurd.
we were very disappointed and remain disappointed. Obviously, it doesn't stop us. And, we've been fortunate. We had a lot of support through US government sources, actually, rather than from Australian sources, which have helped us to do our work over the last 25 years or so. So, but in terms of, like making a buck, as I
Mm.
say, we would be the poorest successful developers of a COVID vaccine on the planet right now.
Yeah, but
But
in terms of just vaccine business in general, just to have some understanding, because I have a lot of
yeah,
people that are business owners on this
yeah,
podcast, and we talk about
mm,
all
yeah,
finance and all
yeah,
that kind of thing. And obviously, you have a business, and it's
yeah.
been successful, till until
It's
recent with all the
well,
government stuff.
it's not it survives. So we survive on, you could call it government handouts or research contracts. So we haven't survived on selling product.
Yeah, okay.
Um,
But you're always ready
so
for something that's coming,
yeah,
and
well, so we see our role, I guess, is really a public health role. Is we get these government grants that allow us to keep functioning. They don't allow us to grow. We've been a small team that's been about the same size now for 15, 20 years. But it keeps us alive.
Mm.
And our interest is, how do we protect the world against, any future pandemic? So that's our passion.
And so
It's
you,
not predicated on making money, because you'd make a vaccine against something that's a constant problem if you want to make money. A
and
pandemic, the trouble is they only come every 10, 20, 30 years. And then when they happen, you aren't even guaranteed that you'll get a product, because it's all a big race. And again, even if you have the best vaccine, doesn't mean it's the one that the government buys and puts all their money into. So it
I mean, that seems stupid. Like, that seems like a
well,
bad setup. Like, not for you, but from the government perspective, if they're funding all these little labs
yeah.
that might have the best products, but then the big dogs are getting it for what I can presume is because they've got more money.
Well, they've got more resources, and so the US. I mean, it was interesting what happened in the US, because the government essentially wrote a check for $1 billion to anyone who had a candidate vaccine,
In the
and that
US?
in the
Yeah,
US,
okay.
yeah. So they gave out about $6 billion. We put our hand up, but we weren't in the US. We get money from them, but we just didn't qualify to
Yeah,
get the
okay.
billion,
Yeah.
and that was upfront money.
Oh, that'd have been good.
Um,
That would have been
so
that'd have been so good.
yeah, so essentially they seeded it all, and but as part of that, they then also, with some companies, said, "Oh, you're too small. You need to partner with a big company. But if you do, here's $1 billion." Like, so
Yeah.
you can use that for leverage. So BioNTech were a tiny company. Pfizer picked up their technology. Pfizer, the biggest pharma company in the world, they had a group about the size of ours, but so it was only through
And they just
Pfizer.
plug into that supply chain essentially,
Yeah,
and then
exactly, and
they'll do
into
a deal and get a
and
cut
into
and
all the regulatory and everything. Yeah, the guys
yeah.
are all billionaires at BioNTech.
Mm, there you go.
So they went from everyday scientists no one had heard of to multi-billionaires. But we didn't.
No,
So
unfortunately
not
not.
that I have any regrets.
I mean, it'd be
Because
good though.
Look,
Can't say it'd
I
be
would.
bad.
It'd be good for Australia, I think,
Yeah.
because apart from anything, it's about proving Australia can, compete on the world stage when it comes to cutting edge technologies and biomedical science.
Mm.
And this was our great opportunity. You know, at least we ultimately did deliver, but not with the government behind us or supporting us, and
So
and
why is
hence why it's in Iran. It's
yeah.
everyone says, why isn't it in Australia?
Well,
Well,
why is that, if you're allowed to speak on that, that, like, did they get it, so they just got it from the US one? Australia just
no,
got it
it's
from the
a,
US, or
no,
was it
it's,
a different lab in
no,
Australia,
it's a
or
different. So University of Queensland lobbied hard right at the beginning and had some powerful lobbyists working for them. So the government just gave them all the money. So
and did they didn't make one though, did
they
they?
failed.
Oh.
Yeah, at phase one,
So why don't they
and they
try
were
again?
behind us. Well, by then they'd committed to Pfizer and they decided, "Oh, bugger it, let's just spend billions of dollars buying overseas vaccines." And I think because they'd neglected us and yet we were the obvious, from the start, we had all the data behind us to
Mm.
prove that we were going to be the successful one. And I can say that because we were the successful one.
Yeah.
But I think they were so embarrassed by the fact they'd picked a loser, and completely, wasted all their money and screwed up, that they then would have preferred that we had not succeeded. To be
Mm.
frank, that's where they ended up.
That sounds like
It was
ego.
like
It's
it
just
was.
ego.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
if you talk at the time, we're talking Greg Hunt and various offsiders in the health department, and when you ask me, that's the only explanation you're left with,
Mm.
because they did have an opportunity, to come back and just pick us up, even because we kept going, even when they didn't support us through that early phase.
Yeah.
But to this day, they remain sort of
Dismissive.
dismissive, which is disappointing, but nothing new and nothing we can't cope with. But as an Australian, it does rankle when I realise what we could have done for Australia's reputation.
And our
Um,
health by the sounds of it, because it doesn't sound like the vaccine that's been rolled out to everybody has actually been good for our overall health in many ways, with the alarming number of adverse events from amps and Asim Malhotra, and what they're saying about it, and what I've heard you say previously. It doesn't look
It
like
certainly,
it's
I
been that
think it's
good.
fair to say that, and I say this having heard, people like, Bill Gates and, you know, Tony Fauci say this. So I can't be accused of, but the performance of the mRNA vaccines, looking backwards now, has been a very disappointing relative to the early promise, that was felt back, when they had that first analysis of the 2-month data and they looked great.
Mm.
And, at that time we didn't know they had all these potential major side effects, but we didn't know about the myocarditis. That only came later. We didn't know that the effectiveness falls away dramatically over time, so it's lost very, very quickly. And we didn't know that they were going to be completely useless at preventing transmission. So, people, all those three things, Tony Fauci and everyone were just counting on based on that early data, and they failed on all three counts. So yes, looking back, you can only say they didn't live up to their expectation, and maybe other technologies that, weren't center stage,
Like yours.
including ours, I would
Yeah.
say, but, not exclusively ours. Maybe they would have done a better job if they'd been allowed to compete, because the irony is it's like in a marathon, it's not the early sprinter who's necessarily going to win the race. In fact, probably they're not going to.
Mm.
And I think the mRNA
That's a great
were the
analogy.
early sprinters.
Yeah.
The problem now is convincing people to admit to their mistakes and giving a chance to the other technologies to now have a shot at saying, well, maybe these might have done better if we'd given them an opportunity.
Well, if you're listening and you have a position of power to reconsider what the current arrangement is with vaccines, I invite you into the perspective that we are all on a floating rock in the middle of space, and it's okay to be wrong. Okay.
Exactly.
Who
And I'm
knows?
sure, again, we're not infallible either, but
Oh, by no means am I. I've in the last week I've gotten people offside.
I do think we have to be honest and state the facts, and similarly, when we look at these other technologies, we have to look at them with the benefit of hindsight and say, where did they perform well
Mm.
and where did they perform badly?
Yeah, well,
And just be honest about it.
Yeah, well, I saw that Tony Abbott, he was saying that we had a pandemic response plan and we just didn't follow it at
Yeah.
all.
No.
Like we'd done the planning and we just went, "Oh, that thing, we don't need that. That's
Yeah, and I
probably
think
we don't
that's
need
where I
that."
think it was laziness and
Yeah.
arrogance. But similarly, WHO, they had a whole pre-pandemic book, and they threw it out on the first day because the politics wasn't conducive to following the book. Like, as I say, shutting down, flights out of China early or anything like that wasn't going to play to the politics. So the thing is, politics should never get into health. Like health doesn't work well when it's
Mm,
run through politics rather than
yes.
for health. And I think
Yeah. That being said, we don't want a technocracy either.
no,
Yeah.
absolutely. Health still has to be responsive to the overall politics. Like, but the politicization of science, the politicization of
Mm.
medicine has
Oh,
been
yeah.
overwhelmingly a negative.
Yeah, like
Do you know what
not
I
being
mean?
able to actually have discussion.
Exactly, that's what I
Yeah,
mean.
yeah, in terms of politicization, in terms of the debate, yes, 100%. I agree.
Because and that's
Yeah.
because of politics that people felt it wasn't politically conducive to have debates. You know what I mean?
Mm.
And the politicians didn't want the scientists to have the debate. They just had their favorite scientists who would tell them and the media what they wanted to hear, and that was clear. They were cherry picked.
And
So
greed,
and you saw
I'm
those
sure,
people
played a
on
part.
television every night
Mm.
because they were prepared to just give the government message. It didn't matter whether it was right
It
or
was their
wrong or
time in the spotlight. They were getting the money. They were getting the attention.
yeah,
It
they were
was the
getting
time.
grants, they were cleaning up.
Yeah, fair.
But it
Well,
did enormous
shout outs to them.
damage,
Shout outs to them.
enormous damage, and it's sad. And again, it takes a long time to repair those reputations. And I think science was damaged enormously over the last 3 years. I think medicine and public health has been massively damaged. Um,
Yeah, for
and
sure.
and probably vaccines as a public health measure has been immeasurably damaged by what's happened. We're going to have to rebuild all of that,
Oh,
and that
100%.
is going to be a lot of work. But
Yeah.
so because we don't want people to abandon vaccines. I mean, I believe in them. I mean, I've seen them work. They're fantastic tools, like for public health.
Mm.
Um, but so yeah, whatever people think about, COVID vaccines and particular vaccines amongst them, don't think that, all
Yeah.
vaccines are bad because that's wrong.
Mm.
They're really great tools, but sometimes they aren't as good as we would have hoped. And some technologies, again, has early promise and doesn't always deliver. And sometimes we get side effects that weren't expected, but when they happen we have to accept them, analyze them, and move on accordingly.
Sounds like we needed the old adage, slow and steady wins the race.
Well, that's what we're counting on. you
Good.
know
Yeah.
3.5 years in and counting, and
Yeah. Well, not from a lack
w-
of trying, from what
no,
I've seen and heard of
we're
you.
still hard at it, and we still think we've got a few little irons in the fire that they could actually, make a difference. So,
Yeah.
um, if not, we'll just go back to making flu vaccines, or there's lots of other vaccines. We're doing a cancer vaccine trial at the moment.
Oh, yeah. What
Yeah,
kind of cancer?
all cancer.
My auntie's got cancer.
Yeah. So
Is it
yeah.
worth having a look at now?
Well, we have what's called an autologous cancer vaccine, so we actually make it from the cancer. So
I've
they
heard of this.
yeah.
Not as a vaccine, but I heard it as a chemo.
Well, no, this isn't chemo. This is taking a piece of their cancer and actually making the vaccine out of it, and then they get the vaccine back as an injection.
That done in Switzerland as well? That biggie over there?
Look, at different forms of it have been done over many, many years, but
Okay. How does that
again,
work?
well, it stimulates your immune system to attack the cancer, just like infectious disease vaccine stimulates your immune system to attack the virus. In this case, we're training it to attack the cancer.
And does that look promising, or like
Does
is
look,
it
yeah.
early?
I mean, it's
How early?
very early. I mean, we've treated a lot of dogs and mice
Yeah, okay.
with cancer, but yeah, this is
Is eradicating or stopping it from growing, or like what's been happening
stopping
with it?
it growing.
Yeah, okay.
But
So an
you know, we've
extender of life at this current stage.
yeah. So it freezes the cancer, is what it appears
To
like. You
put
know, what
in, does that mean that it puts it in remission?
well, remission is normally where the cancer totally disappears.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
you know, so this would be called a partial remission,
Yeah.
in that the cancer goes into stasis, which is unusual. Normally, cancer drugs either you know, kill some of the cancer and shrink it, and then it sort of escapes and
Mm.
grows back even faster. Whereas
Like a
what
dry
we
ice and wart.
yeah, 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 but with this, what we see is it the yeah, the tumor just stops.
Yeah,
It
okay. Is that a
doesn't
good thing?
doesn't go away, but it doesn't. Well, I mean, um, you know, the idea is that they go back to a normal life. Like even the dog owners just come back and say, "Oh, it's back, got its appetite back. It's and
Living?
yeah, like you know, the fact that it has a cancer. I mean, you know, again, if the cancer's not growing and it's not active, the fact that it's still there isn't necessarily what's making them ill, because what we see in the dogs is they you know, they're often lethargic, and you know, a dog with a lot of cancer, and then they have the vaccine and suddenly they're
Yeah, okay.
running around and eating again, and you think, well, you know, the cancer's still there,
Yeah.
but it's not growing, so it's obviously gone into some sort of
Have you seen Dr. Sebi? He was
no.
this nutritionist. He's died now, but he said that through diet and particularly having your body in an alkaline state that you know, he could cure cancers and stuff like that. I haven't delved too deep into it, but I have seen a lot of videos come my way, kind of idolizing him.
Hmm.
So I'm definitely interested in having a look at him. But yeah, do you think food, and have you heard the argument that you know cancer can't grow in an alkaline environment?
Well, I've had friends with cancer who've, you know, tried all of these things. Unfortunately, they
Didn't work.
didn't. You know,
Or
yeah,
fasting? What about the idea of fasting, and that if you do like 7 to 30 day fast, it can like starve
yeah,
the cancer and your body goes, you know, kills it itself. Like,
yeah. Look, I think there's two sides to cancer. Being healthy reduces risk of getting a cancer. That's where
yes.
you have your best opportunity to avoid cancer. Is, you know, to eat healthy,
Mm.
um, and you know, be healthy. Once you've got, you know, well, your body's riddled with cancer, um, you know, that's a very difficult situation to come back from. You know, if you had, say, an early cancer, just a localized cancer, and you had surgery, took it out, I'd say they're the people who should put everything into lifestyle, like to reduce the risk of it coming back, or you know,
Mm.
because there will probably be some cancer cells elsewhere in the body. And
Yeah.
maybe in that situation, you can mop it up. We're also thinking with our vaccine, maybe that's the situation where you could eradicate the
Ah.
cancer, you know, is after that first surgery.
Yeah. Okay.
You know what I mean?
And it
Where
just freezes
maybe
it.
10% of people are going to get a cancer back in the next 5 years. But, you know, because then the immune system doesn't have to do very much. It's just probably going to have to find a few cancer cells and kill them. And that's probably a lot easier than if your whole body is riddled with masses of cancer. So, but yeah, so I think that you know, there's different stages of cancer, but you know, once someone is very advanced, I mean, we have seen some miraculous situations with the vaccine, but equally, we've had people who are on their deathbed, and you know, you could say, well, the vaccine hasn't had time to work, or maybe it didn't. It
Yeah.
wasn't going to work. Do you know what I mean? Um,
Hard to
but
tell.
it's very hard to tell when people are at that very last death's door.
Mm. Yeah.
And it's very hard to even expect a treatment to work at that stage. Do you know what I mean? Because they've tried everything and everything's failed by then, and their
Mm.
immune system presumably has also failed. So I think, that's not a negative or a positive. What we have to look for is where's the right time in a cancer to test these types of treatments out. But my view is the best time would actually be when someone's having their primary cancer taken out, when it may be curative, but maybe not. And
Yeah.
this might just give them that added sort of insurance. So it's a lot of work to be done, and cancer's not an easy area. So
No.
that will take 15, 20 years because
But
it
that's where the emergency use comes into effect, right?
yeah, well, that's the interesting thing. I mean, obviously, you can use these treatments under clinical trials, and so you're still giving them treatment because you're not going to give a placebo in that
Yeah.
situation normally. So you're allowed to do that, but to get it approved and on the market, obviously,
Yeah.
requires enormous time and commitment and resources.
Fair enough.
So you've got all the answers, but that doesn't stop you treating people in the meantime.
Yeah. Okay.
But they just have to be part of a clinical trial.
What do you think the best way to like prevent disease? Like going like how do you live in
Stay a normal body weight.
how
I'm
do
an
yeah,
endocrinologist. I mean,
yeah,
that's
okay.
probably the single biggest factor in the Western world.
Don't get fat.
Don't get
And
fat.
don't get too skinny.
Well, not too many people in danger of getting too skinny in the Western world.
Fair. Yeah, yeah.
In Africa and other places maybe, but no. Once your BMI is over 25, your risk of every disease on the planet,
Mm.
including cancer, goes through the roof.
What do you think about like detoxes? Because I've seen things like liver flushes where you have some enzymes and then you're essentially on the toilet for like a day or two, and you get out
Mm.
all the green like sludge that would turn into like gallbladder stones and stuff like that. You get all those out. Every now and then people do all sorts of detoxes, whether it be
Mm.
fasting, whether it be dry fasting or water fasting or juice
Mm.
fasting for like 3 days or 5 days, 7 days. What do you think about like all those um I guess home remedies, but like those alternative kind of holistic
Yeah,
approaches?
look, I have an open mind, so I think that some of those things that are done, including for religious reasons, the prolonged fasts,
Yeah.
the part of a lot of religious culture,
Yeah.
I think had a medical
Basis.
benefit and basis. Again, the idea you can't eat pork, in the Middle East was because, the tapeworm in the pork.
Mm.
So it was easier to tell people not to eat it for religious reasons than to say, well, if you eat it, you'll get tapeworm. Obviously, they tried that and no one listened. So they made it a religious edict, you'll go to hell. And suddenly everyone stopped eating it, solved the problem. So I think a lot of the things we do, we don't realize are actually um, someone at some point in history has worked out there's a health benefit and have slipped it in there. So I do think fasting is a very very important tool. Because it does drop your weight down for a period of time, even if you regain it. It stops you just continually adding to it, and so I think that has beneficial effects. And I think now the science is looking at how to fast, like, should it be intermittent fasting or, 1 day on, 2 days off, or, should you do the whole, a month of, serious
Yeah, like
fasting. So
Ramadan and
probably a
stuff.
whole range of those things together. Certainly when you fast or calorie restrict, mice or, worms, they live 30% longer.
Wow.
So
30%.
yeah,
What
30%.
kind of fasting?
Well, so that's calorie restricting. So it doesn't seem to matter how you do it so much. And again, you can either just restrict how much food they have access to every day,
Mm.
or just not feed them every third day. And so, but it seems that it doesn't matter which of the methods. That if you calorie restrict them, which again brings their body weight down, then they live 30% longer. So for a human, that would be 20 to 25 years.
That's a
And
lot.
you look at at cultures that are skinny like Japan, they're some of the oldest living people on the planet. So that's why I'm saying, the single biggest thing people could do to prevent all manner of chronic disease, including death from COVID, because overweight people are at much higher risk of death from COVID.
Yeah.
Right?
Just be slim.
Is be slim.
Yeah.
That would have more impact on global health than any other intervention currently, would be everyone losing 3 or 4 kilos on average.
I'm trying to gain.
Are you? Oh, you're lucky.
Yeah.
I'm trying to lose.
Yeah, well.
But it would it would as I say, have a massive impact. Yeah.
No, fair enough. Well, look, thank you so much for your time. I'm sure we could find a whole bunch of other things that I would like to learn about. But yeah, What's Your Voyage is candid conversations with extraordinary people, and you're definitely an extraordinary person that has contributed a lot to this world. I want to say thank you. And look, you're more than welcome to come on anytime you'd like. If you want to get the word out about, a new product that you have on the market and you want to talk about it, like, please, just holler at me. And is there anything else you'd like to say?
No, I think I've said enough already. Probably get me into terrible trouble, but it's been a real pleasure. And yeah, I'd love to have other chats, because I think there are a lot of things you've touched on, outside of vaccines that, I think are important topics for people to openly discuss and explore. Society can only benefit from open discussion, and the idea that we should be shutting down discussion, shutting down free speech, is madness. That's sending us to the dark ages.
Look, those ACMA laws, that's a whole nother discussion we can get into.
Yeah. I'm sure you've got better speakers.
Thank you very much, mate.